Time to get started. Welcome to episode 00, the episode where I don't actually talk about the relief of suffering, but instead talk about the show itself. This is where I explain why I wanted to make the show, the format of the show, and why the production quality is so poor. Okay, why I wanted to make the show. Here's why I wanted to make the show. I suspect our ability to relieve suffering varies according to the ideologies we adopt. I therefore want to evaluate ideologies in terms of how well they enable us to relieve suffering. Of course, evaluating ideologies in terms of how well they enable us to relieve suffering is, at least implicitly, the major objective of a humanities-intensive liberal arts education. My project here might therefore seem redundant in terms of idea content, as it can only echo the theories and arguments we already study in college and hash out on so many other podcast-like shows and whatnot. But I want to do this evaluating of ideologies in a particular way that I've never seen done before. You could say that this particular way is my gimmick for the show. But this gimmick is also something I take seriously. It is the essence of my intellectual character as far as this show goes. What is this gimmick? The gimmick is actually quite simple. The gimmick is to simply stay focused on the goal of relieving suffering. I think we regularly lose that focus, probably without realizing that we have indeed lost that focus. And so, to keep us on track, I propose that we always use that phrase, the relief of suffering, while expressing our evaluation criteria for ideologies, no matter what else we also say, and no matter how deeply and rigorously we analyze and evaluate any given ideology. Let's not ever substitute some other phrase, such as the common good, or God's divine plan, or social justice, or rational self-interest. I strongly suspect those other phrases have a way of derailing our focus on relieving suffering and thereby skewing our analysis and evaluation. I like to think of this gimmick also as an experiment. I want to find out what happens when we try staying focused on the relief of suffering by always using that phrase. I will discuss this experimental gimmick more in this episode after I first explain the format and production quality of the show. As for format, first, I'm trying to make the episodes 30 minutes long so they will work well with television. I intend to have these episodes presented over my local cable access TV station. This means that transitions from one topic to the next will rarely correspond with transitions from one episode to the next. If I exhaust a topic before 30 minutes are up, I may use various filler content to make up the difference. The filler material could be me reciting some poetry, or reading passages from a rough draft of a book I was trying to write, or whatever. In fact, I'll fill up this very episode with a free verse poem. Second, I fantasize about trying a few ongoing collaborative projects throughout the show. I'll now mention a few of them. One, the Issue and Topic Collection project, where we collaborate on compiling a list of issues and topics relevant to evaluating ideologies in terms of how well they promote the relief of suffering. 2, the hyperlinked argument database project, where we collect arguments that support or refute various ideologies and put them into a database where they easily reference one another, such as one of those mind mapping databases, but have it web accessible. 3, the Challenge Question Project, where we compile a list of questions that challenge any proponent of an ideology in such a way as the answer may reveal problems in that ideology's stance on relieving suffering. A classic example of such a challenge question is, how does your ideology handle those who oppose it? These fantasy collaboration projects are an option, depending on how much interest others express. Otherwise, I'll just tinker with them on my own as best I can. In episode 01, the next one, I present my first draft of projects 1 and 3. Otherwise, the format of the show will be evolving and often chaotic. Changing circumstances and opportunities will make it evolve. My lack of discipline will make it often chaotic. Let me elaborate on my discipline problem. While I do feel somewhat driven to process and present a bunch of insights about how to relieve suffering, I don't have the discipline to make a well-organized or consistent presentation of those ideas. The episode you're now watching is fairly well presented because I took the time to write a script to follow. You can see it. If I can point to it. You can see it right there. You're following along with it, aren't you? Right. Okay. I wrote the script, right? A script to follow. But I don't expect to write a script for even half the episodes. It's too much work for me. I'm warning you in advance. Many, perhaps most, of my episodes will likely be an unscripted mess. My unscripted speech patterns tend to be wandering, repetitive, and therefore perhaps even tedious. My lack of discipline is unfortunate. It means my audience may be turned off by my lack of clarity and organization. But I have decided to do the best I can. I can only hope that my audience will be interested enough in relieving suffering that they will compensate for my poor presentation by straining a bit harder to understand what I'm trying to say. I suspect I have some potentially valuable insights about relieving suffering, and I want to get those insights out there, even if I present them poorly. About my poor production quality? Yes, well, naturally my lack of discipline also lowers the production quality of the show. But there's more to this low production quality than just my personal problems. There's a story here I want to tell. For decades, I have fantasized about getting my ideas out into the public realm. I tried to write a book. I considered other types of media shows, but my lack of discipline killed all of my other attempts, such that I just about gave up. But recently, 2 factors combined to inspire me towards trying to make this show. The first factor is the realization that I don't have to do a good job. I don't even have to do an adequate job. I can even suck. I give myself permission to suck. It's more important to me now that I just give it a try. My mantra for this was, at a minimum, just show up and say stuff. The second factor is my access to the media production resources at my local cable access TV station, known as Thurston Community Media. I estimated that my access to these resources would allow me to make the show even at my low level of discipline. That is, even my undisciplined ass could go in there and at least make a show that was technically good in terms of video and audio quality, even if the content was otherwise poorly presented. Of course, the COVID-19 crisis shut Thurston Community Media production facility down. I no longer have access to those assets. So here I am trying to make the show from my bedroom using whatever equipment I happen to have here. This means the video and audio quality will be pretty bad. You are looking right at it and hearing it as it is. This is as good as it gets, and it could get even worse if something breaks. I want to explain the relevance of my lack of discipline here by way of a specific example. Notice how the audio is out of sync with the video image of me talking. This is a problem with the equipment I have. In theory, I could take the time to fix this using the editing software that I also have. In fact, I was tempted to fix it for this very episode. But if I expect to have to fix that syncing problem for every episode, as a matter of standard practice, it will add effort to my process that will make it seem like a daunting task all the time. Given my lack of discipline, the more daunting my production process seems to me, the less likely I'll actually do it. So I need to keep my production as easy as possible by not expecting myself to fix things like sync problems. So again, I'd rather go ahead and try with what I've got than give myself more excuses to do nothing. Other things like my credentials. Now that I've covered those basic things, I want to cover some not so basic things, beginning with my credentials. Unfortunately, I don't consider myself well qualified to do this project. I'm a bad scholar. I don't know much, and like I've been saying, I lack discipline. But at least I admit this and try to maintain an intellectually humble attitude because of it. So I offer my insights about the relief of suffering as just speculation, and I invite you to help me with some of this collaborative projects I mentioned earlier. But now I'd like to elaborate on one of my central speculations that I mentioned earlier in this episode. It's called the Jungian shadow collectivization, or union instead of Junian, whatever. Earlier in this episode, I introduced my gimmick, the policy of always using the expression, the relief of suffering, as opposed to expressions like the common good, God's divine plan, or social justice, or rational self-interest. Okay? And I suggested that we do this to avoid losing focus on the goal of relieving suffering. This implies that we do tend to lose that focus. But how? Why? I invite you to share my speculation that there is some psychological phenomenon that makes us lose that focus. I have come up with a fancy, intellectual-sounding name for this phenomenon. I call it Jungian shadow collectivization. Carl Jung theorized that we have a dark side, a shadow, of callousness and malevolence in our subconscious. It takes control of our actions without our knowing. Not only does it make us do cruel things, but it also makes us deny that we do cruel things. Think of it as a demon that takes over our minds and actions, but goes the extra step of making us deny that the demon even exists. So if each of us as individuals have a Jungian shadow, I think it makes a bit of intuitive sense that our Jungian shadows shape our ideologies, are public discourse on how to relieve suffering. When individuals come together to design an ideology to help relieve suffering, their union shadows will subconsciously collaborate to frame the design process in ways that serve the interests of the union shadow itself. And nobody will be aware that the design had been framed as such. They will all believe they had designed an ideology that will maximize the relief of suffering, unaware that their union shadows had sabotaged their designs to some degree. This is why I put the word collectivization in the name for this phenomenon. What we bring to the process as individuals gets collectivized when we engage in public discourse and design. Does union shadow collectivization really exist? I don't know. For me, right now, it's just a speculation that seems to fit a pattern I think I see. The pattern of ideologies losing their focus on the relief of suffering. Also, a particular interest I would like to bring up is what counts as an ideology. It's a sort of like an overhead thing to cover this basic pre-show episode, whatever. Suppose someone proposes a new ideology that will maximize the relief of suffering. We say, great, let's hear it. And they then tell us, relieve suffering, don't cause it. We say, okay, go on. And then they say, that's it. It's as simple as that. That's the entire content of the ideology. I find it difficult to regard this as an ideology. It's like a tutorial on how to fix your bicycle that has 2 steps. 1, find the problem. 2, fix it. It's too simple. So simple that it is basically useless. To me, a true ideology must be like a useful tutorial. It must offer details that account for different situations, different things that could be broken, different specific contexts. It's got to explain things. Sure, let's relieve suffering and do not cause it. But how? It's not always clear how to do it. It's not always clear why we fail to do it. It's not even clear that it's even possible to relieve suffering any more than we already do. The issue can be relevant here because I suspect many people would suggest veganism is the true ultimate suffering relieving ideology. I would argue that veganism doesn't qualify as a full ideology in the sense that I mean here, but is rather a kind of narrower restatement of the obvious goal. Great! Let's not hurt people or animals. That's an obvious part of the goal, but it might indeed be just a part. What about plants? Do they suffer? Do they feel pain? And if so, what do we do about it? Jainism, on the other hand, could be a fuller ideology, not a mere restatement of the goal. But unfortunately for me, I don't know enough about it to judge its ideological fullness. I invite Jainism experts to weigh in on this matter. But the point here is that ideologies have to be quite a bit more than just a restatement of the goal. An ideology has to be comprehensive. It has to work out a lot of details and address the complexity of life. Another issue I want to cover is the relief requirement. Something else I want to mention here is what I now call the relief requirement. Suppose an ideology works out in great detail how nearly all suffering can be eliminated. The problem is all those details are about the many ways we can kill everyone who is suffering. Yes, by killing everyone who suffers, we can get rid of suffering. But wait, I said relieve suffering, not merely get rid of it. I take the meaning of relieving suffering to be that the sufferer remains alive and enjoying a life free of suffering. Okay, now I'll fill up the rest of this half hour with a free verse poem that I wrote a few years ago. My Heroes at War is the name of the poem. Here it goes. I love people who struggle to relieve suffering of others. They are my heroes. But my heroes have divided themselves into two opposing armies who kill one another over their difference in opinion about how best to relieve suffering. And I have to wonder whether this war they wage creates more suffering than their combined efforts manage to relieve. One of these armies I call my heroes of the abundance premise. These are the ones who believe and shout, "There's enough to go around if only we distribute it all equitably." And scarcity is an illusion created by malevolent capitalists. The other army I call my heroes of the scarcity premise. These are the ones who believe and shout, "Nature is a harsh realm of scarcity. We are plagued by disease and shortages of food and shelter, and even by the scarcity of the healing touch of our fellow beings. And only our ingenuity and productivity can turn nature's scarcity into the abundance that relieves suffering. And we must reward the productivity of each person in proportion to the amount of suffering that their productivity relieves, or they won't produce. And their capacity to relieve suffering will therefore diminish to nothing. And the most efficient way we have to reward one another for the relieving of suffering of the other, and in the proportion to everyone's effectiveness at relieving suffering, is through free market capitalism. And to this, my heroes of the abundance premise reply, your paranoid worries about these scarcities are what created these scarcities, like a self-fulfilling fear. You say diseases come from nature and must be cured through productivity optimization of capitalism. But diseases actually come from the stressful lifestyle of capitalism itself. You say scarcity of food and shelter come from nature and must be abated by the productivity optimization of capitalism. But it is capitalism that brainwashed us to expect more than our fair share of food and shelter, to want a personal surplus of food that others can't eat, and a mansion that would equal 500 modest homes. What we really need is to get rid of greed that capitalism brainwashed us to pretend is natural. And to this, my heroes of the scarcity premise reply, the evidence refutes you. Every time one of you tries these paradises of equity, it fails miserably. By thwarting natural greed, you force a modest standard of living on everyone, saying it is everyone's fair share, hoping they'll get used to it and love it. But it just leads to such lack of motivation to produce that you end up having to force them to produce. That line all over again. But it just leads to such a lack of motivation to produce that you end up having to force them to produce. You force them into slavery to make them relieve one another's misery, hoping they'll deconstruct their greed and reinterpret their greed-defined scarcity as modesty-defined or community-defined abundance. But nobody ever deconstructs the greed, and everyone remains miserable. And your slave state never withers away, but rather gets more draconian each year it tries that much harder to create the abundance it promised. As I watch This endless exchange between my two armies of heroes, with all the flashpoints and horrific wars, all in the name of how best to relieve suffering. I feel like a child, traumatized by watching my mother and father come to threats and blows over how best to raise me, how best to be a loving parent. The truth about how to relieve suffering seems to me like something we should study very objectively without emotional commitment to any given premise about the origins of scarcity. Let's not mess around. This is suffering we're talking about. Let's be serious. Let's re-examine our premises, whether it is a premise of original abundance or a premise of original scarcity. Can someone please be that kind of hero for me? Okay, that's it for this episode 00. I've explained all the basics of the show that I wanted. The next episode will be episode 01, where I will try to get you interested in sticking with the show by saying interesting and provocative things about how ideologies relate to the relief of suffering.